Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me today as we explore the profound and unsettling ideas of Søren Kierkegaard, a philosopher who wrestled with the questions of faith, existence, and what it truly means to be a Christian. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike, and I've made a fair few videos about religion, about the nature of God, and so on. Now, I myself I'm an atheist, but I find the ideas of theology fascinating. And today's video is about Kierkegaard, who is somebody within the realms of religious thought, who I find incredibly interesting. Kierkegaard was a profound thinker, and in many ways redefined what it means to be a Christian. Um, So yeah, that's the point of the video today, is to share some of the ideas that Kierkegaard presented. So Kierkegaard is Christian, was a Christian, and is somebody who doesn't allow us to remain sort of comfortable or complacent. His works confront us with the sort of the radical demands of Christianity, calling us to examine whether we truly live as followers of Christ or merely settle for an easy, cultural form of religion. For Kierkegaard, Christianity is not a system of thought or a social institution. It's an existential task, a way of being in the world that demands our entire self. Today, we will dive into his key ideas, each of which challenges us to not only think differently, but also, and more importantly, to live differently. So there is seven ideas that we're going to cover in this video. The first is faith as an absurd paradoxical commitment. The second is despair as the universal human condition. The third is the night of faith as a model for true Christian living. The fourth is Kierkegaard's critique of what he calls Christendom versus authentic Christianity. The fifth is the importance of subjectivity and personal truth. The sixth is the imitation of Christ as the heart of discipleship. And the seventh is anxiety and sin as gateways to understanding faith. So let's begin with Kierkegaard's most proactive claim, the first one I shared with you, that faith is absurd. So, for Kierkegaard, faith stands at the heart of Christianity, but not faith as mere belief in doctrines or dogmas. Faith, as he describes it, is a leap, a total surrender to the paradox of Christianity. At its core is the incarnation, the claim that God became a man in Jesus Christ. This idea is not just difficult to understand, it's actually incomprehensible to human reason. How can the infinite become finite? How can the eternal enter time? And yet for Kierkegaard, embracing this paradox is the very essence of faith. To illustrate this, Kierkegaard gives us the story of Abraham in his in Kierkegaard's great work, Fear and Trembling. So God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac, a request that defies all logic and morality. And for whatever reason, Abraham doesn't question God or seek to rationalize the command. He simply trusts that somehow, beyond all understanding, God will fulfill his promise. This is what Kierkegaard calls the absurd. Believing when everything seems impossible. Now, at this point, it's worth pointing out that the existentialist philosophers were heavily influenced by Kierkegaard, even though most of the existentialist philosophers were themselves atheists. They were quite heavily influenced by Kierkegaard's ideas, especially this idea of the absurd. We see a similar, although a somewhat reimagined version of it in Albert Camus' philosophy, and also in the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, and to some extent even Hegel. But yeah, so let's try an analogy to hopefully sort of illustrate the the point that Kierkegaard was trying to make. So imagine that you're standing at the edge of a dark chasm. There's no visible bridge to the other side. Faith, as Kierkegaard describes it, is the act of stepping forward, trusting that an unseen bridge will hold you. This leap cannot be justified by logic or evidence. It is an act of trust in something greater. So, faith in this context contrasts really quite sharply with reason and philosophy. Philosophy seeks to explain and systematize. Faith embraces the unexplainable. Reason demands clarity, but faith flourishes in uncertainty. Kierkegaard believed that trying to rationalize Christianity, reducing it to a set of doctrines or ethical principles, stripped it of its transformative power. Kierkegaard asks us, do we have the courage to leap into the absurd, to trust in the paradox of Christ? Or do we remain safely within the boundaries of what we can understand? Now, the second idea of Kierkegaard that we are going to look at, out of his sort of 7 key ideas that we're going to go through in this video, is the idea of despair as the universal human condition. Now, I want to take a moment just to sit with that, just for a moment. Despair as the universal human condition. So in the what was it called? The sickness unto health. No, not unto health. The sickness unto death. Kierkegaard describes despair as the fundamental condition of human existence. It's not a feeling of sadness or depression, but a deep existential disconnection. Despair arises because humans are both finite and infinite, physical and spiritual. We live in a world of time and space, yet we long for eternal meaning and connection with God. This tension creates despair. Kierkegaard identifies 3 forms of despair. So the first form of despair that Kierkegaard identifies is the despair of finitude. And this occurs when we lose ourselves in the finite, in material pursuits, worldly success, or shallow pleasures. A person consumed by ambition or wealth may seem fulfilled but is disconnected from their deeper, eternal self. Think of a workaholic who defines their entire identity by their career. They may achieve great success, but will likely feel an inexplicable emptiness. So the second form of despair that Kierkegaard identifies is the despair of infinitude. So here a person retreats into the realms of ideals, dreams, or spirituality. And in doing so, they neglect the finite realities of life. They may aspire to greatness or holiness, but they avoid the hard work of living in the world. As an example of this, an artist who spends all their time imagining masterpieces, but never creates anything tangible. That's essentially what he's talking about. And the third can't even speak today. The third form of despair identified by Kierkegaard is the despair of defiance. This is the most profound form of despair, where a person refuses to acknowledge their dependence on God. They insist on being self-sufficient, rejecting the need for grace. A self-made entrepreneur who views their success as proof that they need no one, not even God, yet feels isolated and unfulfilled. That's a pretty good example of the despair of defiance. Despair is like being a tree with roots in the ground, i.e. finitude, and branches reaching towards the sky, infinitude. Without balance, the tree either withers in shallow soil or collapses under the weight of its branches. According to Kierkegaard, faith is the cure for despair. It reconciles the finite and infinite dimensions of existence by anchoring us in God. In faith, we fully engage with the world while trusting in God's eternal purpose. So the third idea that we're going to look at of Kierkegaard's is the night of faith. So in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard introduces the night of faith as a model for living, for authentic Christian living. And when I say night, I mean, like swords and suits of armor, that kind of night, not like the opposite of day. So the night of faith embodies absolute trust in God, even in the face of uncertainty and absurdity. So let's compare the night of faith with another of his ideas, the night of infinite resignation. So the night of infinite resignation sacrifices everything for a higher cause but remains in sorrow. For example, a monk who renounces love for A monk who renounces love for God lives with the pain of what they've given up. The knight of faith also sacrifices everything but lives in joy, trusting that God will restore all things they cannot foresee. This is Abraham's faith. He gives up Isaac but trusts that God will fulfill his promise. So a way to think about this is like the knight of faith is like a tightrope walker suspended above an abyss. They walk confidently because they trust in the safety net below, even though they can't see it. So Kierkegaard offers us a challenge within all of this. Becoming a knight of faith is not a one-time decision. It's a daily practice of surrendering to God, trusting in his purposes even when they seem unclear or impossible. So the next idea we're going to look at is what Kierkegaard called Christendom versus authentic Christianity. So when he says Christendom, really he means the sort of the organizational structures of Christianity, the church and all that comes with it. So Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom is one of his most provocative ideas. He believed that Christianity, as it was practiced in 19th century Denmark, had become a hollow institution. Everyone was Christian by default, but very few truly lived out the radical demands of the gospel. In Kierkegaard's time, going to church was a social and societal expectation, much like paying taxes or voting. But this kind of cultural Christianity, he argued, bore little resemblance to the faith of the New Testament. Christendom is like admiring a mountain from a distance and then claiming to have climbed it. Authentic Christianity is the hard, grueling ascent, embracing the challenges and sacrifices of discipleship. within all of this, Kierkegaard has somewhat of a call to action, essentially. So authentic Christianity demands more than church attendance or moral respectability. It requires a total transformation of life, a willingness to take up one's cross and follow Christ. So let's look at the next idea on the list, the fifth idea, and that is the idea of subjectivity and the inner life. Kierkegaard made a statement, and it's incredibly famous, and that statement is, truth is subjectivity. And it's often been misunderstood. He doesn't mean that truth is relative. Rather, he means that the most important truths, such as faith in God, must be personally experienced and lived. As an analogy, you can think of it like this. Faith is like music. You can analyze its structure, study its notes, and discuss its history. But until you hear it and feel it resonate in your soul, you don't truly know it. So Kierkegaard's insight essentially was that Christianity is not about knowing doctrines or debating theology. It's about a lived relationship with God. Each person must confront God individually in the solitude of their own soul. So that was the subjectivity in the inner life. And now we're going to move on to the next idea that Kierkegaard quite famously proposed, and that was the idea of imitation of Christ. So for Kierkegaard, the essence of Christianity is the imitation of Christ. This means not just admiring Jesus as a historical figure, but also striving to live as he lived. As an example, Jesus forgave his enemies, loved the marginalized, and endured suffering for the sake of truth. True discipleship involves doing the same, even when it costs us dearly. So a good analogy of this is admiring Christ is like admiring a painting in a museum. Imitating Christ is like taking up a brush and painting your own masterpiece, inspired by the original, but requiring effort, creativity, and sacrifice. And Kierkegaard challenges us. Are we content to admire Christ from a distance? Or are we willing to follow him even if it means hardship? Now, a final idea that we're going to look at is, very briefly, is the idea of anxiety and sin as gateways to faith. In his great work, The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard describes anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. It arises when we confront the infinite possibilities of our existence, including the ability to choose good or evil. This anxiety is not something to be avoided. It's a necessary part of the human condition. A good analogy of this is that anxiety is like standing at the edge of an open ocean. The possibilities are vast and overwhelming, but they also hold the promise of discovery. So I think Kierkegaard's sort of key insight from all of this is that anxiety points us toward our dependence on God. It's a gateway to faith, which grounds us in the eternal, even as we navigate the uncertainties of life. So as you can see from all that we've briefly touched on, and these introductions to these sort of key ideas of Kierkegaard really are just that. They are just introductions. There's a lot more to them. Each idea could do with a video or a series of videos on their own. And it is something I plan to do in the future. But in the meantime, this, I think, is a good place to start when trying to understand the ideas of Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard challenges us to move beyond like the superficial religiosity into radical, transformative life of authentic Christianity. He calls us to embrace the absurd, confront our despair, and imitate Christ with our whole being. So as we leave here today, let's reflect. Are we living as knights of faith, or are we settling for the safety of Christendom? Are we willing to leap into the infinite, trusting in the God who calls us? So that's Kierkegaard's ideas. Hope you found it interesting. I certainly am fascinated by Kierkegaard and the way that he sort of reimagined Christianity, and also the influence that Kierkegaard's work had on later philosophers and thinkers. So as always, if you enjoyed the video, then please do all the things that YouTubers ask you to do. So like the video, subscribe to the channel, and all that good stuff. If you have any questions about Kierkegaard, then please, by all means, jump in the comments and fire away, and I will do my very best to answer them. And if you think I've misunderstood any of Kierkegaard's thoughts and ideas, then please jump in the comments and yell at me about how stupid I am, and let me know what was wrong and why it's wrong. Because that, first and foremost, it allows me to refine my own knowledge, which is wonderful, because learning is, after all, a collaborative experience. But it also means that anybody watching the video and reading the comments also gains from the insight as well. So yeah, thank you very much for spending 20 or so minutes with me. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and I very much look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.